pleasure to introduce Dave now. So I had the pleasure of meeting Dave this week on the Alfred course it was teaching on, and if any of you have not done it, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best courses I've ever been on, absolutely fantastic. So Dave has got a bit of a dream job. So he's a lecturer, and he's also an educator at the Alfred and at Monash, previously working in the UK in Liverpool. And for those of you who are also UK trainees like myself, the Archem FoamMed, Dave has had a huge impact in that, in education, and really bringing emergency medicine in the UK up to speed, and I'd like to say as good as you guys here in Australia. So I'm really looking forward to Dave's talk, and Dave is going to talk about maintaining skills and preventing skills fade. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So, yeah, as Jamie says, I'm an emergency physician working at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne, but half of my job is medical education. It really is a bit of a dream job for me. And so I'm going to be talking about maintaining skills and preventing skills fade, and I'll unapologetically be talking about a little bit of educational theory, but hopefully it'll be relevant to your practice. It's going to be as it relates to trauma, but I think a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about could be applied to any area of your clinical practice. So I'm going to talk through a bit about, before we talk about skills fade, we really have to think about what actually are skills and how we can think about those in different categories. Then we'll talk about skills fade itself, and a little bit about what we can actually do to prevent it. So first of all, skills. Well, skill is a very general term, but if you break it down into different categories, it really is just knowledge, cognition, and physical psychomotor skills. And knowledge is the easy one. That's just stuff that you know. That's your anatomy, physiology, your pharmacology, your ability to read x-rays, your knowledge of, the phrenic nerve runs laterally down the pericardium, things like that. That's just knowledge. It's the stuff that you know. Cognition is your decision-making capacity, your sense-making, your pattern recognition, and really in trauma and in resus, this is probably your ability to team lead. This is taking lots of different inputs, the mechanism of injury, the picture that the paramedics have given you, the hemodynamics on the monitor, the feedback from the person doing the primary survey, the x-rays that you're looking at, your previous experience, everything like that channels in, and then decisions come out. Do we go to scan, or do we go to theater? Do we give more blood products? Which blood products do we give, et cetera, et cetera? And that's all the cogs turning in your brain at any given time. And then when we talk about skills in trauma, this is the one that everybody gets excited about. It's the physical skills, the psychomotor skills. But really, that's anything from putting in an IV cannula to a thoracotomy. So it's any step-by-step physical procedure that you do, the muscle memory side of it. But I left it to last because I know that emergency clinicians love delayed gratification, so that's why it's in there. So what is skills fade? Well, really, it's just the decay in any ability or adeptness to perform something over a period of non-use. So it's just use it or lose it. And as emergency clinicians, as much as some of us would love to, we can't and don't look after major trauma patients all day, every day of every single shift. Excuse me. With the advent of major trauma centers, certainly in developing countries, there's been a funneling of these major trauma patients towards major trauma centers. And while that's great, probably for the sickest patients, because we're able to focus our resources and expertise in these centers, that leads to this inevitable decline in experience in any of the surrounding centers that don't receive the same trauma cases. But if you do work in a major trauma center, don't be kidding yourself that you're not at risk of skills fade in trauma. I work at the Alfred. It's one of the biggest, busiest trauma centers in the country, but so do maybe 60 other emergency physicians. And we see plenty of non-trauma cases too. We have our chest pains, our back pains, our deliriums, our old person that fell over, stubbed toes, sprained ankles, and they all still need to be seen too. And between the non-trauma cases and our non-clinical work, our annual leave, our study leave, and the trauma gods just conspiring against us so that you get your first trauma shift in a while and you see nothing but a shoulder dislocation, but the next day your colleague sees a thoracotomy, you can't, even with the access to the trauma cases, you can't guarantee that you're going to stay up to date, particularly in the physical aspect, the trauma skills. And just a caveat, I don't want patients to get into trauma, but if they do, I want it to be on the day that I'm on shift. So you'll probably recognize this. The Dunning-Kruger curve, we probably all recognize that we've all been on different parts of that curve at different points in our training, and we probably all know people at different points on that curve too. And it's basically the balance of competence against confidence. And while it's generally talking about you as an overall in all of your skills, you can actually apply that to any one particular aspect of your skills set. And it's all about, as we gain competence, we climb this slope of enlightenment to the plateau of sustainability where we're a guru or an expert. But my question is, how sustainable is that plateau really? Because I think there's a third factor that's not considered on this curve. It should be a z-axis. It's quite hard to draw a 3D diagram, but that's time. Because really the third aspect when you're considering skills fade is your currency. So we've got our competence, we've got our confidence, we've got our currency. And really, an erosion of any one of those three is going to cause skills fade. Currency is obvious. If you haven't done something recently, you're going to be less familiar with it. Confidence, if the last time you put in an IO, it didn't work, or there was a bad outcome for the patient, or someone came down and said, oh, I can't believe you put it in the leg instead of the arm. And so anything that's going to erode your confidence is going to erode your skill at performing that technique the next time. And then competence, that probably falls under how you train to do the thing in the first place. If you haven't been taught the best and most efficient way and you haven't had a chance to practice it, that's going to make you more prone to skills fade in the first place. But the question is, why do we care? Why does it even matter? And the thing that most people think about as to why skills fade matters is proficiency. If I don't do something as much, I'm not as good at it, I can't do that physical thing as well. But the second factor, and I think it's underappreciated and probably more important, is your cognitive bandwidth. Because if you're struggling to remember how to do something, it's going to take up more of your mental capacity to think about how to do it. So this is your brain. This is the anatomy part of it for your knowledge. This is the skill, the technique, the procedure that you haven't done for a couple of years. You used to know how to do it, but you haven't done it for a couple of years, but now you think it might need done. And it takes up X amount of your mental capacity. But here's the other decisions that you're also having to process while you're looking after a trauma patient. Whereas if you have kept yourself up to date by keeping those 3 points of the triangle, then this is that procedure. It takes, you have that muscle memory for how to perform it. You know the indications, you've run through it, you know where the equipment lies, you know who you need to talk to get that done. And so you've got all this extra space for those other decisions. So you've got this free cognitive bandwidth. Now the next question is, how long does it take before skills start to fade? And when I was looking into this, there's actually a report that was commissioned by the GMC from the UK, where I originally trained, in 2014. Now, they were interested in looking at doctors who had been out of training or out of medical practice for an amount of time, and they wanted to know how long that time would be before they would need some extra support when they returned to practice. But actually, a lot of the research that they look at is quite applicable to our questions here today. The evidence they look at actually comes largely from medical education research. There's a lot of teaching trainees on a simulated mannequin and how long did they retain that skill for. But also they looked at some military data because military practitioners, they're going to be called upon to perform procedures that they're probably not doing very often in civilian practice, and it might be quite a significant period of time between their tours of duty. Now, they looked at lots of different studies. I read the reports, so you don't have to. Of the studies were varying size, varying design, varying quality, but overall, they concluded that skills will fade over a period of 6 to 18 months, with the steepest point of the curve in those first couple of months, and then plateauing out to about 18, maybe 24 months. Now, this curve itself, for any educationists in the room, they might recognize that this is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. probably more relevant to people who are trying to study for their fellowship exams. And this was actually described in the 19th century, but it fits perfectly to what the GMC findings were as well. They also found there was a couple of other mitigating factors. Obviously, it depends on the person, depends on the skill, depends on your pre-existing skill set. But this is, in general, what happens after you've learned a new skill. So then we know what it is, we know how long we've got before it starts to happen. So what can we do about it? Well, like everything in medicine, prevention is better than cure. And a lot of the literature on this touches on a concept of overlearning. Now, when I was in medical school, if someone had told me that I would ever be standing in front of a room of people trying to convince them to overlearn something, I would have laughed them out of the room. Because why would you learn something more than the absolute point that you know enough about it? Why would you do even more? But they've actually shown that if you overlearn, so you practice a skill beyond the point at which you're already considered proficient at it, you will have almost a dose response to your retention of knowledge at the end. So the best way to describe it is probably, some studies say that for doing a surgical airway, a cricothyroidotomy, you have to go through the skill probably 5 times before you're proficient at it from a physical skill side of things. If you then go through the whole procedure 5 more times, that's 100% overlearning. And that might put your retention at the end there. If you do it another 5 times, that's 200% overlearning, and that would put your end point there. So the next thing you can do is interrupt that curve entirely. You can reset it. And again, those of you who have been studying more recently will probably recognize this as spaced repetition, and that's reviewing the content that you've read already. But all that's doing is resetting that forgetting curve and giving you a reset in that 6 to 18 month time frame. And I think when we're talking trauma, the most important aspect of our clinical skills fit is going to be the practical skills. And there's some skills that you're guaranteed you're not going to see often enough in your clinical practice wherever you work to be able to stay up to date on them. And those are the HALO procedures. Now, HALO is the high acuity, low occurrence procedures, sometimes referred to as HILF, the high impact, low frequency. And now that varies depending on your place of practice and your own personal experience, but I've distilled it down to 5 examples for trauma. I'm not saying these are the only HALO techniques, and what's a HALO to me might not be a HALO to your practice, and you just have to consider what you would have. But when it comes to trauma patients in general, I think surgical airway, orbital decompression, so your lateral canthotomy, cantholysis, resuscitated thoracotomy, resuscitative hysterotomy, and escharotomies are all HALO procedures. So the next thing then we need to think about is how can we practice these skills if they're so low occurrence? Well, HALOs sit beautifully in this zone of simulation, but so do some other techniques. So we've got our high acuity, high opportunity techniques. And again, depending on where you work, I would probably put chest drains in this category. Then you've got your low acuity, low opportunity, and that might be retrograde, your ethogram or something like that. And then you've got your low acuity, high opportunity, your IV cannulas. But when you're thinking about these quadrants, you really have to think about your own practice, your own skill set, your own patients that you see, and decide what fits in there. But things that sit in the zone of simulation, that's just because you're not going to see them in real life, and really your only option is to simulate them. So then, what are our options for simulating, for hitting that reset button on the forgetting curve? Well, there's a few, and they're kind of in descending order here. But first of all, if you've practiced the real scenario, if you've done the real procedure under real circumstances, that's probably as high fidelity as you can get. But the caveat to that would be it would have to be well practiced with, if you've not done it before, with a supervisor that's able to guide you through it and that you actually get valuable learning points and you reflect on it, but it's still going to be the best you can do. The next option is cadavers. Now, as Jamie said, we were teaching our cadaveric procedures course earlier this week, and that's on human cadavers, but that could also be on animal cadavers, and there's some studies that show in surgical airways, for example, that deer airways are a better fidelity than using your simulated models. The next, for cadavers, you're talking about actually doing the psychomotor skills as well. It's quite hard to get cadavers in the overall cognition skill and as part of running a trauma scenario. So then that leads us to traditional simulation. And I think that in two different ways as well. You've got your in situ simulation, and Vic Brazel, that's speaking after me, may touch upon that, because she does a lot of in situ and translational simulation, but that's really just incorporating a technique into a trauma scenario as part of your daily practice. So you do it in your resus bay, in your trauma room, as part of a scenario. So you've got the clinical decision-making being done, the decision to put in a chest drain, then you've got a model that lets you put in the chest drain and that you see how everything works. The nursing staff have to assist with the equipment. The specialists have to be there to help. You can work on the aftercare. So it's all part of a big thing, but that is resource heavy. You have to have the space, you have to have the time, you have to have the will. But you've also got then a lower fidelity option where you just do it in a simulated room, in a sim room, but still going through the whole case, and that lets you practice some of those cognition skills. And then you've got models. Now those can be some really expensive 3D printed silicon models and all fancy things that you have to put in grants to get. But it can also be, as I'll show you in a moment, some really low fidelity options that you can put together and build at home. And there's some really creative people out there who've published on really good ways to cheaply make models to practice these halos, and you can incorporate them into your simulation really easily. And then finally, I've put it at the bottom of the list, but I think it's really underrated, mental simulation. And this could be as simple as, you know someone's coming in with airway burns, you've got 10 minutes, and spending 2 or 3 of those minutes mentally running through how you're going to do a surgical airway. Where do I find the kit? When am I making the decision? What to do afterwards? How am I securing the tube in place once it's in? Where am I marking the neck? Things like that. And you can run through any of the techniques or any clinical scenario in your head, but you just have to ask those questions and try and run through it step by step. So how do we keep a track of when we need to refresh ourselves? And I'm sure a lot of trainees in the room probably still keep logbooks of their procedures, and some consultants may still write up until our CPD points are ticked off, and then you stop paying attention for the rest of the year. But now, conflict of interest. The Notion app is an app that's free to use on its base level program or its base level subscription, and I use it for a lot of project management in education. And I use it for almost everything. And my education fellow, Benula, who's sitting in the audience there, this is my conflict of interest statement. He bet me that I couldn't find a way that Notion would be useful in skills fade and include it in my talk, and so now he has to buy me a beer tonight, because this is free to use, and you can access it through this link or through this QR code. And I just threw it together where you've got a list of your Halo techniques, and you can add whatever to it. But if you click in the date that you last performed it or reviewed it, and then select how you reviewed it, it'll tell you when your next due date is to review it. And I've just picked numbers out of the air with, if you've read it, it adds 6 months. If you've simulated it, it adds 12 months. If you've performed it, it adds 18 months. And you can change that depending on what you feel for your own clinical practice. But most importantly, Benula, anything cold and expensive will do, okay? So I mentioned earlier that we'd talk through the simulation options, because I don't think it always has to be anything particularly expensive or hard to do. And so if we talk about orbital decompression, this is the model that's actually quoted in quite a few different texts. And it's quite a cheap thing to put together. And there's a link that I'll share with the guys to tweet out later for a YouTube video on how to make this as well. And you could easily incorporate that into your simulated scenarios. Thoracotomy, the thoracotomy simulators that you buy are very expensive, and the extra products to keep reusing it are very expensive too. This is relatively inexpensive. The paper, they say it's $337 US thereabouts, but it would be reusable. And you put this together, and again, it's a nice simulated mannequin. You can include it as part of your simulated scenarios, and again, we'll share the links later. Now this one, I taught some of our medical students a month or so ago. They're the surgically interested ones, invited us to come and teach chest drains. And they sent me this paper beforehand, and they said, we're gonna build this, and this is what you're gonna be teaching us on. And this is one of the best fidelity chest drain simulators that I've ever used. It was really good. It's pork belly over a couple of wooden slats with some duct tape for the different layers of pleura, and you can feel the pop through the different layers, and you can attach it to the mannequin and drape it so that it becomes part of the scenario. And I tell you that I was so impressed. And we went through maybe 30 medical students and taught them how to put chest drains in with the highest fidelity that they could next to putting in a cadaver. Or then there's the really simple, really cheap toilet roll tube with a bit of foam over the top to simulate your surgical airway, because as anybody that was on the course with us in the first couple of days of the week, it's actually a really straightforward procedure. You just have to learn how to do it almost blind without looking, and you can do it through a toilet roll tube. Not to discourage you from coming to our course. I still want you to come to our course, but you could do it on a toilet roll tube. And then finally, as part of our course, the guys, particularly Chris Groombridge, invented Mildred. Mildred is our resuscitative hysterotomy model, which involves things like yoga mats that we buy from Kmart. But you can put this together and it becomes a reusable mannequin that, again, you can put as part of your scenario. And we've published on this and how to do it as well. And again, I'll share those links. So finally, acquiring and maintaining skills takes effort. There's no easy way to do almost anything in medicine, but this is our own responsibility. You have to decide what your risk of skills fade is, and you have to work proactively from that to maintain your skills. The ballpark figure is probably 18 to 24 months. Again, it depends on what your other transferable skills are, but if you haven't performed a skill that you're going to be called upon or could be called upon in that last 18 to 24 months, you need to do something to reset that forgetting curve, because we never know when these scenarios are going to come up. And now when I was asked to come and give this talk because my colleague Chris that invented Mildred wasn't able to make it to Darwin, but I spoke to him when I was putting it together, and he just came out with this brilliant quote that I just had to include as a final thought. No patient should lose sight, a limb, or their life from a treatable condition next to a critical care doctor with a scalpel. And that really hit home with me. So thanks very much, and I look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Dave. That was a fascinating talk, and I love the use of those models as well. They're absolutely amazing. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Oh, it's coming.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Amy and I work in the trauma centre at John Hunter in Newcastle in the retrieval service and teach on a cadaver course. So I've got total buy-in to what you're saying. In your place of work, is there something that's recommended for all your colleagues to be doing this personally, or is this, spread the enthusiasm and everybody maintains it on the best of their ability? Because I know we teach our registrars, we look out for our registrar skills, we often defer our procedures to our registrars. But in terms of our colleagues, it feels that it's about everyone's own personal buy-in. And is there something that you do about that at your place of work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Obviously, we have, sorry, I'll step away from that speaker so I don't get feedback. Obviously, we have the advantage of we run the procedures course, and so our colleagues are able to get in on that and often instruct on it, and there's a core of us that would be very into those sort of skills. But like I said before, there's maybe 50 or 60 emergency physicians, so keeping them all up, and not everyone's interested in trauma. Some people work there because it's just a nice place to work otherwise too. I think the college is probably going to change in the next couple of years to introduce a bit of more credentialing requirements, but at the minute it is very much your own personal responsibility. We don't have any set ones other than you have to be credentialed if you want to be able to do resuscitative thoracotomies in the department, but then we also have the support of our trauma service, which is largely made up of FACEM, so emergency physicians, who are credentialed in it as well, so there's a bit of crossover. But no, to answer your question, we don't have a set requirement, and I think it would be a very hard thing to police, because as I said, I think your own risk of skills fade. It's very hard to prescribe things, and then I think you're at risk of missing what I think isn't an important procedure for you to update might be actually really important for your own practice. So unfortunately, it comes down to our own professionalism.
Any other questions? We've got one at the front here. Yep.
Oh, it's a race. Yep.
Quick question. Once the procedure's been done, watching videos, is there any data that shows that helps keeps the skills?
There's no data on it, and again, it's a very hard thing to study. A lot of the studies are just reassessing people at the 6 months, 12 months, 18 months Some of them look into have you re-simulated the skill or practiced something similar in the meantime. But there's nothing conclusive on what constitutes as a good refresher. I think watching a video is very reasonable as long as you consider also the indications and aftercare as well. And one of the things for that Notion chart that I had up, when you click on any of those things, you can bring up your notes on it, and I would include links to any videos or anything there. I think it would be really useful to refresh. Before I would do a lateral conthotomy or something, I think I'd probably rewatch our procedures course video, and that's even though I teach it 5 or 10 times a year.
Another question over here? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you know of any good IT solutions. You know, I was thinking sort of something you could do as like a procedure in your office, so you'd have a list of procedures and then you could do it on a computer simulation, if that's useful or not a useful solution.
Yeah, you're touching upon one of my other areas of interest, which is virtual simulation. There are expensive VR softwares that can let you do that, and there's some expensive non-VR, but still going through procedures softwares that let you do that. But I don't think that's going to give you the psychomotor skills. That's really just going to refresh your memory on the step-by-step basis of going through it. And actually, there's some really low fidelity, the virtual resus room scenarios, and that's free to access, where you can have scenarios where you have to go through by demonstrating where you would go on the neck and how talking through step-by-step of the procedure. But I think really the biggest bang for your buck is going to be doing it as part of a scenario, so that you're really touching on your knowledge, cognition, and physical skills.
Any other questions? Owen, just there, yeah.
Hi, Raj and Kailanathan from Monash. You just mentioned about the virtual reality. We do have a virtual reality set up, and I'll just already answer the question, but I think it does add a value in a way. The procedures that we don't do that very often, even as a consultant, like for example, pericardial syndesis or putting a pacing wire to pace or something like that, that's very rare procedures. The option we have is probably watching a YouTube video versus practicing that in a virtual reality just before doing the procedure. In that note, the virtual reality add so much value.
Completely agree. If you're fortunate enough to have access to it and can incorporate it into your clinical space like that, that's great. I just think it's very hard for people to achieve that, but I'd love to play with the machine. Sounds like great fun.
Any other questions we'll probably bring into the panel discussion. So thank you so much, Dave. That was an awesome talk.